But hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Frisbie. I'm a student of art history, art, and global studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the States. And today I will present my study of the medieval graffiti of the Palais des Papes in Avignon, which was funded by UNC's Robinson Fellowship. It's a rather trivial thing, uninteresting except for in the case of graffiti left by the author, but which will bring, I hope, its modest contribution to the history of Avignon. This is the conclusion of a 1987 report written by a certain Jean Loki. Until now, Loki is the only researcher to publish on the graffiti of the Palais des Papes in Avignon. He gravely underestimated the power and potential of these graffitis that cover to the point of overlapping the walls of this largest Gothic palace in the world. Presenting a survey of the graffiti of the Studium or study of Benedict XII and of the portail or portal to the Grande Chapelle, which is the Great Chapel, upon which can be found approximately 200 particularly notable graffiti, I hope to spark a renewed interest in this corpus. The Palais des Papes in Avignon was the center of the French medieval papacy from 1309 to 1377 and residence of 9 popes. The first, Clement V, settled in Avignon in 1309 with the intent of a temporary stay, perhaps to resolve the Templar affairs, according to the research of the chief curator of the palace, Dominique Vantin. During the papacy of John XXII, I suppose so, a decade later, the old palace began its construction and has since changed over the centuries almost as much as it has changed hands. Under Benedict XII, with the direction of architect Pierre Aubry, the palace was largely demolished and reconstructed for the Opus Novum, the new palace from 1336. Pope Clement VI, unanimously elected in 1342, renovated the palace again under the direction of the architect Jean du Louvre. Under the vice-legate, the palace was renovated up until the iconoclasm of the French Revolution. During the 19th century, around 2,000 soldiers occupied the site, destroying and reconstructing a large portion of the palace to accommodate a barracks and a prison. The majority of intense studies on these renovations began in the 20th century when the Palais was reimagined as a tourist destination. Since then, it has become a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1995. With the renovations of the Benedictine Pope Benedict XII, the Studium was constructed in 1333. It's linked to a long reception room, the Chambre du Parlement, and to the Pope's chamber by passing through a narrow corridor. The walls of the Studium were originally covered with frescoes of botanical rinceaux and red flowers on a blue background of lapis lazuli. The floor is tiled with uniquely painted tiles, the designs of which were protected in some places by what were likely large coffers against the west wall and in the corners of the room. After Benedict XII, the Studium was transformed into a passageway with the construction of an extension called the Roma in 1364, and it would have attached right here. The Italian architect Matteo Giovannetti headed its construction. In order to construct it, had to pierce a door in the east wall of the Studium. One of the stories was composed of a colonnade, the second was used as an art gallery, and the function of the third remains unknown. The Roma was completely demolished by 1837. The Grande Chapelle was consecrated to Saints Peter and Paul in 1336 and finished in 1351 under Clement VI, who guaranteed indulgences to pilgrims that came there. During each reception of the new vice-legate, the reading of papal bulls took place inside the Grand Chapel. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the offices of the Pope also took place in the Grand Chapel. The portal was constructed after the Grand Chapel. Soon after, it broke under the weight of the lintel and was reconstructed in 1359. The portal is accessible from the stairway of honor that leads to the loggia. The window of indulgence lights up the loggia. This is where the Pope would have addressed the people, surrounded by cardinals and other officials of the church. To localize the graffiti on the walls, I created maps with scale-drawn coordinates. Each square of the grid measures 25 centimeters, and the file of information on each tag includes an index number, a coordinate on the map grid, an epigraph, a description, and around 20 photos. The descriptions of each graffito were created on site, an analysis of depth, of the tool used, speed of inscription and style, expertise of the graffiteur, etc. The type of utensil used is difficult to identify given the varied dating of each stratum. For example, the trumeau of the portail of hard rock renders the graffiti as nearly as invisible as well as fragile. Thus, it was not advised to take rubbings. To give architectural context to the maps, photogrammetric models of the entirety of the studium and the portail were taken, which you just saw. Both the photogrammetric images and the raking light images were also limited by the lack of soft and uniform light, a problem that could have been ameliorated with the help of more expensive professional grade ambient and raking lights. Taking budgetary limits into account, I used Agisoft Standard in place of Agisoft Pro. The military destroyed several sections of the portail that have since been reconstructed. The graffiti that remain vary in condition according to their placement. At the level of the bench, the graffiti have been rubbed away with time and thus are very patinated, while those that are up high are preserved regardless of their date of creation, and thus we must depend only on their letter forms to date them. The stratigraphy of the studium posed several technical problems. The walls in this room were covered and recovered by coats of plaster, sealant, whitewash, and paint, up to 23 strata in total. A large portion of the superficial layer, specifically on the west and south walls, was gravely damaged by soldiers with violent hatches that lifted all coats of whitewash down to the blue and red frescoes of Benedict XII, even cutting the stone underneath. It's thus probable that numerous graffiti have been covered or destroyed over the centuries. The majority of the graffiti are on the fine plaster that covers the first layer dated to the 15th century. Thus, the graffiti inscribed there can be dated since then. Since it's difficult to write on this type of layer, the depth that remains after these damage, coupled with the rectitude, the fineness, the detail, and the continuity of the engraved lines, indicate the nature of the graffiti of the palace, its formality, its intentionality, and its liminality in a revealing way. I present here only the graffiti dated from the construction of the studium up until the Reformation in the 16th century, as well as the graffiti that are not yet datable that present a pertinent interest to those which are medieval. Taking into account each typological variation, we might begin to better understand the scope of the graffiti of the portail and in the studium, and identify the ways that we could possibly research these in the future. I will begin with the symbols. The laurel crown on the portail, for example, can refer to victory or heraldic symbols that contain it. On the north wall of the studium, in an obscure corner, is written what resembles a half-destroyed swastika pelta, which is also known as Solomon's knot, whose function is presumed to be apotropaic. This knot is next to half of a lozenged S, of which there are two other examples. These S's, with their lozenged empatments, like this florid decoration of the ronceau of the Pope's bedchamber, illuminations or signs of distraction or imagination. There are also distinct double-stemmed S's, sometimes circumscribed by a circle, as well as a collection of lines that resemble musical scores, starting with a Gothic S. Several others are created either by someone who is distracted or someone who desired protection. On the left side of the portail toward the bottom, incised as if the graffiteur was seated on the bench, is a hexafoil, also called a daisy wheel or rosace, created by a compass whose needle marks remain visible. A four-part circle in the graffito of 13 concentric circles in the studium can be attributed to sun poles. Attached to a devotional heart that is also divided into fourths, there's a zigzag protrusion associated with a pine tree, according to Lucien Gratier's Index of Signs. The Chi-Rho symbols, of which the majority are focused onto the center column of the studium, are varied. And here are some of those. The pictorial category is just as revealing, even though they're rare and difficult to date. Marcia Kupfer views the pictorial graffiti of Douay-la-Fontaine as evidence of the internalization of cult images and a mediation between the human and divine. Effectively, three profiles in human form in procession suggest medieval monks. However, the woman lightly scratched in the plaster and partially covered by a military layer of plaster, and the unpatented graffiti of a nude woman suggests desires or satires of the graffiter. The only architectural graffiti found at the sites are this crenellated altar or tower and this tombstone, which are emblematic of structures that serve the physical world to a metaphysical end. The potential effects of frescoes, illuminations, and architectural sculptures on these graffiti present an interesting incursion into the conscious or subconscious of the graffiter and his relationship with the visual culture of the time. Even more present in this corpus, particularly on the Palais, are dozens of heraldic inscriptions that indicate the presence of a member of a family. The Palais represents a unique and liminal space between political processions and a space claimed as sacred. On the Palais of the Chapelle, where one would presume the presence of devotional graffiti, one finds familiar heraldry. Since the space around the Palais was a monumental entry to political and religious ceremonies, coats of arms become monumental witnesses to the power of a family. Their power is political, but the action of writing them is devotional, an affirmation of an eternal identity. Several heraldic symbols have been identified with the help of Provençal archives. On the portail is almost certainly a Vichy coat of arms with its distinct dental motif, but the majority of the others are less clear. We can make out the Guigonot coat of arms with its three grelots placed on the bend, and Basset with its central pine cone. Even the intact coats of arms can showcase an iconography that the graffiter imagined, approximated, or badly remembered, and as a result, many are difficult to distinguish. Several more general motifs can be found on the other coats of arms, such as the fleur-de-lis and keys. In further studies, it will be necessary to analyze if these motifs indicate a heraldic program of a noble family, of the Pope, or of the king, and if they critique or praise their reigns. The fact that these coats of arms were sometimes destroyed indicates their political power. Beyond simply expressing one's social rank, graffitied heraldry reflects a duration, a need for immortality linked to the concept of eternal life. Just as names declare, "I was here," heraldic symbols, as Matthew Champion says, deliberately insert themselves in a physical and permanent way into the Christian narrative. The majority of coats of arms on the Palais are replaced with names, initials, and entire sentences in the Studium. The initials, which are either monograms or devotional stenography, include the letters G, E, P, A, and R. The enormous size of a Gothic R in the Studium indicates that it wasn't entirely forbidden to carve on the walls, because this graffiti would have taken a lot of time in the sight of anyone nearby and much concentration to carve. On the right of the portail toward the bottom, the initials CP are distinguished from other initials by a traced shadow. Archaeologist Matthew Champion has identified two similar English initials as either monograms or merchant's marks. Like the initials, the large part of names are found on the walls of the Studium at eye level. This one is the name Jacques Gage, followed by several damaged letters and then a line of currently indecipherable letters. According to genealogical study, the forms of the name Jacques Gage were present in Connery, Pays de la Loire, at the end of the 16th century. The name Cabin is in minute scratches at tall eye level among several inscriptions of varied size, naming a family of the 15th and 16th centuries that lived largely in l'Homme, a northern department in France, and in the Loire-Saône and Loire. Milana is an Italian name. In France, it's not found beyond the Alpes-Maritimes and the Piedmont. At the present moment, no mention of visitors to the palace with such names has been found in the archives of the city of Avignon. Even so, these names are not necessarily those of the graffiteurs themselves. Often graffiteurs were known for writing the names of others on the walls, an act of devotion, of memory, and of vicarious duration. One of the most distinct names on the walls of the studium is the name Ville-le-Garde, of which the le in the middle appears damaged. Consequently, we might deduce either Ville-Garde, a name that dates to the 16th century, or Ville-le-Garde, read as Ville-la-Garde, a commune in the department of Var. In this place saturated with sacred and political power, graffiti of names assumes a devotional and social aspect. According to Mark Hanley, graffiti of names can replace the action of taking relics from sacred sites, or according to Annette Jones, can declare allegiance to political or religious power. But I assert as well that they're performative. These graffiti self-authenticate themselves as witnesses to a presence in the space, like a guest book. I show finally a selection of graffiti of phrases arranged on each panel of the portrait, of which several are legible and several are not. Contrary to those which are legible for political reasons, the model reader of a legible graffiti is God himself, according to Clément Dussart. In this way, the illegibility of the graffiti in the palace imposes its devotional prayer, but in the view of all. These ritual graffiti thus satisfy a political need without mitigating their religious effect. This study serves as a first incursion into the domain of the Palais des Papes, the medieval and late medieval graffiti of which are largely unstudied. The first step in the future is to integrate these findings into the database of the Palais des Papes, with the eventual goal of making them publicly accessible digital exhibitions and encouraging further research. In this way, the graffiti of the palace will contribute to understandings of these complicated histories and will be better preserved in the days to come. Thank you all so much. I was wondering if any of y'all have any questions, if we happen to have any time. If you want more images, you can feel free to contact me at this email. Thank you so much.